Okay, so we'll start off with number one. What you'll do is you'll write the question on your sheet of paper, and then for the first 8 slides, there'll be some terms that you'll need to define. Okay, so write the question or whatever you see on the screen, and then what you'll do is you'll write the definition of that particular term. If you don't know the answer, just go ahead and leave it blank, and then we'll end up coming back to it later on where I'll provide you with the answers. Okay, so if you all can just as well make sure that you're muted also. Okay, number one, flexion. Write the definition of flexion. Number two, extension. Definition of extension. Number three, write the definition of abduction. Four, definition of adduction. Five, definition of agonist. Six, definition of antagonist. Seven, definition of origin. Eight, definition of insertion. Nine, 10, and 11. So nine, write down angle of the joint is, and then write down what the angle is and what joint is it. So is it elbow, shoulder, hip, ankle, knee, etc. So angle of the joint is, and then write down blank the joint and then the angle. So shoulder flexion, for example. So angle of the joint is blank. There should be 2 fill-in answers, blank, blank. Again, angle of the joint is for number 9 in blue. What's the angle and what joint is it? Number 10, the muscle number 10 is pointing to is blank. And then number 10, the muscle number 10 is pointing to is blank. You can also put the colors down on your sheet. So you could put green and blue, etc. To help you with memory. If you were to go back over this sheet for review for the quiz, it might be helpful for you to remember what 10 was if you had the color down there. It's not mandatory, just if it's something that might help you with color coordination. Number 11, the same thing as number 10. The muscle at number 11 is, or the muscle number 11 is pointing to is what is it? So fill in the blank there. So 9 is the angle, 10 is the muscle, and 11 is the muscle. You can put the muscle group or you can put an individual muscle. Either one is fine. Number 12. Number 12, the angle of the joint is, and then again, what's the joint and what's the angle? Thirteen, again, the angle of the joint is, give me the joint and give me what angle is it. 14 is the same thing. I want the joint and what is the angle, not the degree, but again, dorsiflexion, extension, flexion, abduction, adduction. What is that angle or motion or position of the joint? What does it refer to? So 13 is the angle or position of the joint. 14 is angle or position of the joint. 15, same thing, angle of the joint or position of the joint. And what is the joint? (16) and 17. 16 again, angle or position of the joint. And what is the joint? 17, position of the joint. And again, what is the joint? (18) and 19 both. 18, angle and position of the joint. What's the joint? 19, angle and position of the joint. What's the joint? 20, the muscle. What muscle is the pink arrow pointing to? 21, what muscle is the green arrow pointing to, or muscle group? Okay, 22, angle of the joint or position of the joint. What's the joint? '23, muscle group. It's the arrow is pointing to. 24, position of the joint or action. Again, as action it's performing or motion. So 22, action, position of the joint. 23, muscle. 24, action or position of the joint. 25, 25, and 26. So 25 in orange is the origin of that muscle. So 27 is the muscle also. I want the muscle of 27. 25, what is the origin of that muscle group? Or that one, the longest muscle. So there's a muscle there. If you were to specifically use one of the longest muscles, let's just say 27, give me the muscle group. Okay, but let's just say the rectus femoris was a part of that muscle group, which it is. What is the origin of the rectus femoris on number 25? So rectus femoris, 25, origin of the rectus femoris for 25. '26, angle or position of the joint. '26, angle or position of the joint or action. 27 is the muscle group. 28 is the insertion of the rectus femoris and the other muscles of that muscle group of the anterior thigh. So 28 is what is the insertion point of the muscle group of the anterior thigh. Okay, so 22, angle or position. 23, muscle. 24, angle or position. 25, origin. 26, the angular position. 27, the muscle group. 28, the insertion of that muscle group. Last slide. 29, insertion. 29, insertion of the muscle group of the anterior thigh. 30, origin of the muscle group on the posterior thigh. So the muscle group of the posterior thigh, what is the origin of that muscle group? That's for 30. So 29, insertion of the anterior thigh muscle group, that's 29. 30, origin of the posterior muscle group. 31, angle or position of that joint. And what's the joint? And then 32, angle or position of that joint. What's the joint? And what's the position called? So 29, insertion. Anterior thigh. 30, origin. Posterior thigh. 31, position of that joint, give me the joint. 32, position of that joint, give me the joint. Flexion. Oh, sorry, real quick. So what I would like for those of you who are here online to do now is take all of the answers from 1 to 32 right up on the upper left-hand corner of your sheet. Write the number of answers you answered, you think you answered correctly, okay, out of 32. All of the answers you're confident you answered correctly. Before we go with the answers, write it up on the upper left-hand corner of your sheet. Put the number that you think you answered correctly over 32. Okay, so let me go back to the, let me go back over the answers. So number 1, flexion, a decrease in angle at a joint. So, so if you didn't complete it, if you left the answer blank, fill in the answer. Okay, but if you got it wrong, also change the answer or correct it. Okay, and that way you have a good understanding of the actual correct answer. Okay, so number 1, decrease in angle at a joint. 2, extension is an increase in angle at a joint. 3, abduction, moving away from midline. Moving away from midline. 4, adduction, moving toward or crossing midline. 1, agonist, prime mover, or muscle, which is the primary mover to create an action. So prime mover or muscle, which is the primary mover to create an action. Antagonist, muscle which opposes the prime mover, or muscle which opposes the muscle which creates the primary movement of a joint. Okay, so it opposes the agonist. It's a muscle that opposes the prime mover or the agonist, or the muscle which opposes the muscle which creates the primary movement of a joint. So basically with that answer, I'm saying the exact same thing, but the second more lengthy answer just kind of articulates maybe a little bit more clearly the first part of that answer. Okay, origin, the fixed point of attachment of a muscle. The fixed point of attachment of a muscle. Insertion, the movable point of attachment of a muscle. Okay, so let's go back over the answers from the slides. So 9, answer is knee flexion. 9 is knee flexion. 10 is the quadricep group. Quadricep group. 11, hamstring group. Now you could have put any of the muscles of the quadricep on there as well for 10, and any of the muscles of the hamstring group for 11. So quadricep 10, hamstring 11. 12, knee flexion. Twelve is knee flexion. 13, knee flexion. 14, hip flexion. 13, knee flexion. 14, hip flexion. 15, knee flexion. 15 knee flexion. 16, knee flexion. 17, hip flexion. So I'm pausing a little bit between each slide to give you time to write down the answers if you didn't have them down. So 16, knee flexion. 17, hip flexion. Knee flexion 16, 17, hip flexion. 18 and 19, both knee flexion. So 18 and 19, knee flexion. So 18 and 19, knee flexion. 20 is quadricep group. 13, hamstring group. 20, quadricep group. 21, hamstring group. So again, 20 quadricep, 21 hamstring. Twenty-two, knee extension. So knee extension. 23, hamstring group. 24, knee flexion. So 22, knee extension, 23, hamstring, 24, knee flexion, 25, anterior, inferior iliac spine. Or you could put pelvis, or you could put ilium. Okay, so pelvis or ilium on 25, or the actual bony landmark where it actually originates from and attaches to, anterior inferior iliac spine. That would be what you would be responsible for knowing tomorrow, or on the future quizzes, or any future quiz that you might have where this slideshow would help you. Or for just helping you understand the origins, insertions, and actions better, being able to identify the bony landmark where that muscle originates from. So 25, pelvis, ilium, or anterior inferior iliac spine. 26, hip extension. Hip extension. We're going to call it hip extension, even though it's more neutral. We're going to call it hip extension just for the purposes of this review. It's almost a little bit in hip flexion, but I don't want to confuse you. So we're going to call it hip extension. 27, quadricep group. 28, tibial tuberosity. Tibial tuberosity. So 22, knee extension, 23, hamstring, 24, knee flexion, 25, pelvis or ilium, 26, hip extension, 27, quadricep group, 28, tibial tuberosity. Last four, 29, tibial tuberosity, 30, ischial tuberosity, ischial tuberosity, 29, tibial tuberosity, 30, ischial tuberosity, 31, hip flexion, 32, knee flexion, 31, hip flexion, 32, knee flexion. So 29, tibial tuberosity, 30, ischial tuberosity, 31, hip flexion, 32, knee flexion. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to count up all of the answers you answered correctly out of 32. Put that on the upper right-hand corner of your sheet. And this review should give you a better idea as to where you are in terms of understanding the names of the muscle groups of the anterior posterior thigh, the origins or the actions that occur at the hip and the knee, and then some of the origins and the insertion, the majority of the origins and the majority of the insertions for the muscles of the anterior and posterior thigh.